Hi, good afternoon, everybody. This is Frank McNally from Public Spend Forum. We're going to get started here in just a second, but we did have a couple quick housekeeping items. If you're unable to hear us through your computer audio, you can check on the bottom right of your screen, and there's a question and answer box, and we've provided a call-in line, so you can see the dial-in and passcode information there if you'd prefer to dial in on your phone. That's also a great place to ask questions. We do encourage you to do that throughout the presentation, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. So hold tight for just another moment or two while we let some folks get in, and we'll get started in just a second. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to Public Spend Forum's webinar on selling to the government. This webinar is first of our series on learning the government, which is focused on helping suppliers get smarter about public sector markets. I am Raj Sharma, Chairman and founder of PSF. Today, I'm excited to be joined by esteemed Professor Steve Kelman from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Welcome, Steve.
Hi, Raj. Welcome to the listeners as well.
Great. So I'll provide you a more detailed bio of Steve in a minute, and he does have a pretty phenomenal resume. Let me go ahead and first tell you about the agenda. So today's agenda, first we'll start off by just telling you a little bit about Public Spend Forum. I promise that'll be very short. And from there, we'll jump into the discussion with Steve Kelman on really the topic of selling to government. We've broken it down into a couple of things. One, why government markets matter, and we'll cover some success stories there. Then we will talk a little bit about what you need to know and learn about public sector. Of course, that can be a week-long or a month-long or a year-long course sometimes. But
anybody who wants to sign up for that, you're welcome.
Yes, Steve. So we'll cover that briefly today just to inform you on what are the things that you should start to get smarter about. And then we'll even touch on towards the end what good government customers look like, and frankly, which customers to stay away from. If you do have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. There is a little box on the bottom right. If you have any questions, please send them to us, and we'll towards the end, we'll go and take a look. And if we're not able to answer all of them, we'll come back and definitely respond offline. All right, so Public Spend Forum. In short, Public Spend Forum is a knowledge network and impact accelerator for public procurement. What does that really mean? Well, we believe that information, knowledge, and data, as well as a general lack of collaboration, is what undermines most public procurement. Therefore, we've really set up Public Spend Forum to focus on both buyers, suppliers, as well as stakeholders across governments to provide them best practice standards. And that goes beyond just best practice insights, but really to start to create some standards across the world, market insights and market intelligence, and a global expert network and community. Ultimately, if you look on the bottom of this slide on the left, our goal is to reduce waste, improve and streamline the procurement process, reduce barriers to entry and innovation so we can have more participation by suppliers, as well as more access for government to innovation. And by the way, that means not just new suppliers, but also incumbent suppliers that already work with government but are sometimes frustrated with the way they have to respond and the inflexibility that prevents them from bringing more innovative solutions. And then finally, ultimately, the most important point on this slide, improving the ability of government to serve their citizens. So if you move to the next slide, just very quickly, there are a few things coming out that I wanted to just make you aware of. One is we'll be publishing the first ever public procurement measurement standard, which is coming out. It will highlight specific measures that we believe need to be on a scorecard for measuring the effectiveness of public procurement. We'll also be publishing a workforce standard around competencies. And we're already working with a number of players, including NIGP, which many of you may know, to do a number of pilots around that. We'll also be publishing a report and holding a symposium on public procurement technology market. We believe technology is an important enabler to procurement outcomes that I just mentioned, and so we'll be publishing a report on that. And then finally, we are going to be introducing a market accelerator for suppliers, which combines training, market intelligence, mentor networks, and more. And just the final point I just wanted to make about Public Spend Forum and jump into our discussion is about the progress we've made. So we already have a global community of over 10,000 subscribers from over 40 countries from across all levels of government. We also have formed formal and informal partnerships with a number of organizations, and we continue to form more. Organizations such as Michigan State University, One Defense, which is focused on bringing new players into the defense market, Mid-Tier Advocacy, which works with mid-tier suppliers on addressing their challenges. We're working with NIGP, which is a great organization that works with government professionals across state or local and state levels of government, and the World Bank, who we've been working with on some of the public procurement measures. So I encourage you to visit our site and learn more, but with that, I'd like to just go ahead and jump into our conversation. So let me first start with the question of why should anyone sell to government? Steve will provide his insights shortly, but let me just preface by showing you one slide. This chart here shows you the size of the public sector market globally, which is approximately $10 trillion. As you may have heard that number before, so that's a global number, $10 trillion, and we have verified that number. Of course, that's not just one monolithic market. That's many markets, U.S., Europe, everywhere, state, local, federal levels of government. U.S. accounts for approximately $2 trillion of that market. Federal government within the U.S. is $450 billion, and then state and local is about $1.5 trillion. And then OECD countries are about $4.5 trillion. We just wanted to put this slide up as we jump into the discussion with Steve, just to give you a sense of the size and the magnitude of the of this market. So, Steve, let me turn to you. Well, you've had a very long, distinguished career working inside government as a White House appointee in charge of all federal procurement. And then, of course, outside of government, you've looked at procurement for a long time, as well as broader public policy issues at Harvard. So, Steve, besides the size of government, why should suppliers that are on the call or on the webinar here, as well as others, consider working with government? What makes government so exciting?
Well, Raj, obviously, as you said, it's a very big market. It also, though, can be a complicated and difficult market. So why participate in it? I once asked a young guy who left the commercial business a few years ago to set up a small firm that was selling tech to the U.S. government. He's grown to about 50 employees at this point. I asked, why did you do it? Why leave the commercial technology space? And he said, I would rather spend my time developing a way for the VA, the Veterans Administration, to serve veterans better than to spend it developing a new photo sharing app. And I think that response from him really hits the nail on the head. I was lucky enough to get a award earlier this year from a industry association. And before the dinner, I went around and just sort of buttonholing and talking to a number of the people at the event, most of whom were sort of worker bee government contracts, not senior executives or whatever. I asked them, what's the thing you like the most about your job? I also asked what they like the least, but I'll give the answer to the first. The most common answer they gave for what they liked the most about their job was the opportunity to help the missions of the organizations we're working for. And I guess I'd say to the listeners that if the idea of making an impact, helping the world, very corny, but if that doesn't mean anything to you, it may not be worth it for you to enter the federal marketplace or the government marketplace in general. I think if that does make some difference to you, if it is important to you, that's an important reason to enter a government marketplace.
Great. No, that's a great example, Steve. And I know you have some more examples for us in terms of suppliers that are doing some interesting things in government. So maybe we can start there. Before we get into talking about the differences between government and private sector and some of the things that everyone should know, we thought it'd be good to start with some examples of some interesting stories. So can you share the 3 examples that you've told us about?
Sure. Well, let's start with one that probably many of the listeners are familiar with, Elon Musk and Spacex, selling his satellites to NASA and the Department of Defense. So he developed a way, smart guy, to produce and launch these satellites at about 1/2 the cost that the government was paying from the sort of legacy defense contractor who was supplying it. He had never sold to the government before. There were these very entrenched contractors there. He succeeded in persuading both NASA and the Defense Department to give him multi-billion-dollar contracts to supply his equipment. Now, some of you will probably say, well, he's a celebrity. I'm not Elon Musk. That's true, but so let me give you 2 examples that don't involve people who are celebrities. One is actually the very other end. It's a very, very tiny firm. This is in the area of spy satellites. This has become a current events issue because of the North Korean missile tests. It turns out, I didn't know this before, it turns out that spy satellites can only take pictures during daytime or sunny weather. So a lot of the time they can't even take pictures, which is obviously a problem if you need real-time knowledge of where these missiles are moving and so forth. Turns out there does exist an existing technology to allow spy satellites to take pictures all the time. It was developed actually in the 1950s by a defense contractor. The problem with it is these satellites that they developed cost $500 million a pop, and it's just been too expensive for the Defense Department to use. Recently, however, a young 26-year-old immigrant from Iran developed a way to allow satellites to take pictures all day around in all weather conditions. His satellite costs, instead of $500 million a pop, $1 million a pop. He's this tiny, he started out just, it's his invention. He now has a very, very small company. Obviously an outsider, has no connections in the government, no anything. Just on the strength of his technology, he's actually interested in the Defense Department in buying from him. There's also some talk of actually investing in his company. Fascinating example.
Yes, Steve, I was going to say now it sounds like if you were trying to hide under the clouds in your homes from satellites, you can't even do that anymore.
Well, hopefully soon. As soon as the Defense Department buys his stuff, that'll be true. Okay. Especially if you're in North Korea.
Yeah.
But anyway, a third example, so traditionally and still today, a lot of the software that is developed for U.S. government agencies, and probably state and local and even internationally as well, is what's called enterprise software. It's very complex, very expensive, a lot of bells and whistles, different from the kinds of software development that's used for a lot of particularly consumer-facing internet applications. There are a number of small firms in the government market space, tech firms, that specialize in bringing this less expensive, more commercial technology into the government marketplace and have had success doing that. So what's really all these examples have in common, I think, especially if you're an outsider, you're a non-incumbent, you're coming into sort of the beginning, the more that what you're selling really offers something new and different, which could be dramatically decreased costs, improved functionality. With any luck, you will be able to get the attention of the government to be able to sell your stuff.
Great. Now, those are really good examples, Steve, and hopefully there is a little bit of diversity. And I wanted to share another one I had, which is really a state-local example. And the problem here is hungry kids can't learn. We all know that. And the government, as we know, the U.S. government provides benefits where you get nutritional assistance. And there's a program called SNAP, and that feeds 45 million Americans, and 10 million of those people actually don't enroll. So Code for America worked with the government of California to build an app called Get Cal Fresh, and they've all of a sudden started enrolling a lot of people that were sitting on the sidelines. And now you have more kids getting the food they need, getting the nutrition they need. They've cut the application time down from 45 minutes to 10 minutes. And this is just another example. Like you said earlier, if you want to have an impact, there are lots of ways to have impact, and these are just some examples, hopefully, that hit home for people. I also want to stress before we move to the kind of discussion on processes, et cetera, is that the government buys everything you can imagine under the sun, right? So there are lots of opportunities across the board for suppliers to make a difference. So if we, Steve, just transition to really just a little bit of a discussion. We know this can be somewhat of a kind of a long discussion and a dry discussion sometimes. I know I've had this many times. It's really one about what are the differences between private and public sector that suppliers need to understand. Again, as we mentioned, this could take a long time, but can you just give us a very high-level view of what are the 3 or 4 key differences between public and private sector market?
Sure, Raj. There are a number of differences, and one thing they have in common, unfortunately, is they all make it more difficult and expensive for companies to sell to the government compared to selling to non-government customers. It's just that there are things you can try to do about it, but it is a fact of life there. I think the 4 areas where there are differences, one is in terms of the procurement process itself. So how does the government go about choosing a supplier? The second is requirements that sometimes exist, not always, but sometimes exist for companies to provide detailed information about their production costs to the government in connection with being awarded a contract. The third is the nature of intellectual property rights protection. And then the fourth is requirements that often exist for government contractors to comply with various public policies that go beyond what would be required of just any business.
Great, yeah, and I think this is a good way to categorize, and we know that the first starting step, of course, for any supplier should be: do you have a product or service, and does the government have a need? Right? Is there a match first and foremost? Right? If you answer that question, then looking into these 4 areas is really important. So why don't we just go ahead and have just a brief discussion on each one of these areas. So first of all, the procurement process. Steve, you've sometimes mentioned that there is what you call the official system of procurement, and then there are deviations that can happen. Could you just talk about what the official system means for our listeners?
So I think that the most obvious difference to a new vendor or potential new vendor between the government and the private sector is the way the government chooses suppliers in the first place. And it's, I think, a very common reason why commercial companies refuse to bid for government business. They say, too arcane, too bureaucratic, too complicated. Now, there's something to that criticism, although you really should realize that any time you as a company enter a new industry you've never competed in before, you need to learn jargon and procedures that are special for that industry. So the government is completely different there. But you asked about, so what is that, what I'm calling the official procurement system? The basic idea is the purpose of this system is the government is trying to set up a level playing field that gives everybody a fair opportunity to compete for government business. And to do that, they have, in the private sector, often if you want to sell to a customer, you go to that customer, persuade them your stuff is good, and then they just go ahead and buy it. That's not how the government.
By the way, Steve, that even in the private sector, that's not necessarily true any longer. There's a lot more strategic sourcing and those kind of things, so you have to go through the procurement department. I think suppliers are finding out.
Right. So it depends. You're absolutely right. I agree with you, Raj. But much more often it is possible simply to make a sale.
Yeah.
Depending on what you're selling. So that's not how the government works. The government wants to open the opportunity to bid to everybody, and this is centered around a very formal process involving RFPs, requests for proposals, where people who want to sell to the government respond to these with a written proposal that explains why, in their opinion, the government should do business with them. And that process of preparing a written proposal can be very complicated. One of the features of it that has no real corresponding feature in the private sector is the idea that if the government in its RFP says, here are 12 things we want from you, you must, in your proposal, your written proposal, explain for all of those 12 things how you're going to do what the government wants. If you only answer 10 or 11, you're going to be graded down in the evaluation process. You might not get the contract. So you have to basically track what's in the RFP in your proposal. Once you've written this proposal, and the proposal has a lot of features, it has what's called a technical approach, which is how you're going to do the work, your management plan, a whole bunch of stuff, a lot of stuff you have to write down. These proposals often are quite long. Once the proposals come in, the government has a quite formal system to evaluate them. If it's a big procurement, you'll set up inside the government a committee with one or more people who will each evaluate the price, the technical approach, the management, and so forth. Those people will go through the whole proposal and score each part of the proposal. Then the committee votes, ranks it, and so forth, and then is sent up a chain to a source selection official, who's usually a more senior civil servant. He looks at all the scores and so forth and makes a decision. That's the formal system.
Great. And hopefully we haven't scared off too many people yet. And what I want to just mention as we talk...
It's better from here, I hope.
I think there's a recognition of that. You talk about state governments. There's on the Public Spend Forum site, we just wrote about a couple of stories that are related to cities, federal government. Across Europe, I think Ireland just published some policies around streamlining procurement. So one thing I would just like to mention is, this official system that's been created with the intent, right, to create an open level playing field, there is a recognition that, it's become maybe too complicated. And so there are a lot of things happening to streamline and make it easier for suppliers to do business with government. So with that, Steve, what are some of the departures that you see that potentially make the system a little less complicated than what you just described?
So there are different ways the government has developed to allow government to pre-select a smaller number of companies who are then authorized to bid for specific kinds of work, rather than going out every time to everyone in the world. That then allows those smaller number of companies to simplify their proposals and allows the government to speed how fast work is awarded. In the U.S. federal government, the two most common examples of that, first is called the Gsa Schedules. Gsa stands for General Service Administration. The Gsa Schedules are a list of specific products and services, so a specific product like a model number or whatever, or services and each of them is attached to a price and to a series of terms and conditions on a contract. And that once that schedule, that price list or that list is developed, then a government customer, if they're spending under $150,000 on what they want to buy from you, they can just go to you and just buy directly off the schedule directly. No proposal. It's very simple. They just say, Company A, I like your thing. The price is okay. I want to buy it. And they can, as long as it's only up to $150,000, they can just go ahead and buy it. No proposal, no bureaucracy. If it's over $150,000, and it's a product, they still need to get, they need to get 3 quotes rather than 1, and they need to ask for a price reduction off of the price that's on the schedule, but still no proposal. So it's very, very simple. For services, it's somewhat more complicated. There they usually develop a statement of work, and also there, no matter how much you're buying for, you need to get 3 proposals, 3 bidders. So if they're buying services, they go out with a statement of work. They have to ask 3 people to bid on it. Those 3 bidders will need to put in a proposal, but it's simpler than what you would normally have in the traditional project process. So that's the GSA schedule. Those are 50 or 60 years old. They've been around for a long time. A more recent change, which came in the 1990s, is actually, I think you're going to say something called indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts.
Yeah. No, and Steve, I think one thing, I'd love to talk about that in a second, but I was just going to comment that the 150K is an important thing for suppliers to note because, and that amount even, is, at least in the federal government they're looking at, but different governments you should look into, if you're a supplier, what those levels are for more simplified processes. And because that makes it a little bit easier, and a lot of times smaller suppliers can bring their products for lesser amounts. So in terms of IDIQ, I know you had some thoughts in terms of what are IDIQ contracts and how suppliers can use those.
I do. I'm embarrassed. I forgot to just add one more thing about the GSA schedules, which is it generally takes, you have to submit some information about commercial invoices, what your commercial pricing is. It generally takes 3 months once you've submitted that information to get onto the schedule. However, if you're a small business, currently for cyber services, cloud services, and healthcare, or they're hoping to expand that, they'll get you on the schedule in 1 month rather than 3 months. Also, if you're a startup, normally you have to provide 2 years of financial information to the government, to GSA to get a schedule. If you're a startup, you don't need to provide any financials, just a resume showing the past experience of the founder. So GSA is doing various things to make it easier for small businesses and startups to get on the GSA schedules. I interrupted myself. I meant to say that before. Just very quickly on the IDIQ contracts, these started in the 90s. The basic way they work is that the government has a full traditional kind of competition for sort of a master contract. And that master contract has certain kinds of services that are under, like could be very broad, like IT services. It could be more narrow, like cyber security services or cloud services. And what the government does, they do a regular competition, and they choose a limited number of contractors to be on that contract. Then what happens is that there are individual orders. They're called task orders for services, delivery orders for products, individual orders that are only competed among those who have won the original contract. So it's a much smaller group. Again, you can do it much quicker. If you're a new company or a small business, don't even try to bid as a prime on one of those contracts. There are some that are open only to small business, but if you're a startup or a new firm in the marketplace, you cannot win one of these contracts at a prime level. However, you can be a sub. And that's the route into the system for a lot of new entrants into the government marketplace is to work to become a sub on an IDIQ contract.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's a pretty good explanation, and people can find more on I think GSA's US GSA site. I also wanted to.
It's a brilliant explanation.
It is a brilliant explanation.
Just joking.
I also, I think we had a comment from one of our listeners here, Chandra Conklin. She mentioned that, RFQ process sometimes can be easier across different levels, and sometimes their governments can also, for smaller companies, actually make it exclusively for anything under 150K, make it less than, or make it exclusive to them or a small business. So there are ways. Again, just it requires a little bit of learning, but there are ways to streamline. I know, Steve, you like the term, how can I get to you? You've said that, that's a good thing to hear. Tell me why. How can I get to you?
Yeah, so if you as a supplier are trying to sell to a government customer, and that customer says to you the following magic words, how can I get to you? That should be music to your ears. What that government customer is saying is, I like your product, I like your service, I'm interested in you. What is a way to give you a chance to bid for this work that doesn't go through the whole traditional procurement process? Some simplified way to allow you to bid for this work. So they're basically asking, what kinds of IDIQ contracts are you on? Are you on the Gsa Schedules? What are some ways that are simpler for me as the government to give you a chance to bid for my business? So that means they're seriously interested in you. It's good news. Hope you hear that a lot as you start in this business.
Great. I will say, I think suppliers should note that down, that how do I get to you? You should always have an answer before you go to a meeting, because that means you've really done your homework, and you're bringing something to the table, like you said, that's of value. So I know there are three more areas we just mentioned, so maybe we can just quickly touch on them, Steve, in the interest of time. So IP is another important area, especially for tech companies, anybody developing, really competing on the basis of, new technologies, differentiating based on new innovations they're bringing to the market. What advice do you want to give our listeners on intellectual property?
So again, the government rules on IP are designed to sort of protect the government's interests against being taken advantage of. And it's a complicated area. If you're developing or you have or developing IP, you should know a lot more about this than I'm able to tell you now. So I'm not an expert in the area, but what I can give you is the very basic overview of the government system. And at a basic level, it's pretty straightforward, which is if you've developed IP yourself without any government money, you just developed it, you own your IP. If you sell, something to the government that uses that IP, the government gets a one-time license, free license to use it for the purpose of that contract, but can't use it any other way. They can't give it to anybody else. They can't use it for another contract. That's if you're developing it yourself. However, if the government has paid part or all of the development costs for your IP, they get a lot more rights, and a lot of times a lot more rights. Again, this is very complicated, but typically the government can give your IP to a competitor to use on another contract within the agency. That is to say, for example, there's a reprocurement of a similar item. When the government does the reprocurement, even if they bought it from you the first time, with your IP, they can make that IP available to a competitor if they do a recompete. In theory, the government IP rights could be even broader than that. In theory, in some situations, they could actually give your IP to a competitor just to sell to the general marketplace. However, in reality, that essentially never happens. A lot of this is a matter of negotiation, but those are the basic principles.
All right, Steve, I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead to, outside of, I know we had financial and other disclosures and policies which suppliers should study up on. But I want to move ahead in the interest of time to innovative processes that government is working to put in place. Now, you have some examples, I think, from federal, and I can highlight some that are happening, other places as well. But again, there is a movement afoot. Could you talk about, what are some innovative things you're seeing that really kind of caught your attention?
Yeah, there's some innovative things going on which are quite new, where the common element of them is they are trying to reduce the burden of preparing these very complicated written proposals. That's what they have in common. My favorite, and I think we're showing a screenshot of their website, is a website run by the General Services Administration called challenge.gov. This has started in the last 5 years. It's become very popular. What procurement challenges are is the government, these are sometimes in the private sector called procurement contests. Some may have heard that phrase. So what this is, the government goes out and says, here is a problem we'd like to have solved. So an example I think you see on this homepage from challenge.gov that I think you're seeing now is that the TSA, Transportation Security Administration, wants to develop improved algorithms to screen passengers for screening at airports. And what they're doing is they're saying, if anybody has any suggestions, come to us with your suggestions. We will make available $1.5 million in prizes to the best suggestions we get for improved algorithms to use. So the way to respond to this, no proposal, no bureaucracy, no anything. All you do is you do work. You develop your idea, in this case, your idea for algorithms. You submit that to the government, and the government then chooses either a winner or several winners. This has been a very successful way of attracting startups, people who've never done business with the government before. College students bid for these. This is a very, very innovative thing the government's doing. I would really check it out. No proposal, no bureaucracy, none of that. It's all, what can you do? A second, somewhat related, is we're seeing more and more in the government people who are saying, government agencies who are saying, instead of having you guys submit a proposal in response to our RFP, we're going to have just a tech demo. Anyone who wants to bid on our contract, you're going to come in on a certain day, and we're going to give you something to work on, an actual problem. It would be similar to what you'd work on if you really got this contract. You spend a day working on it, see what you produce, and then the government evaluates you not based on what you've written on a 300-page proposal, but on what your engineers have produced that day. Again, no bureaucracy. It is performance-heavy, bureaucracy-light. There's a somewhat older one is the government's use, and it's also a more uncommon, of competitive prototypes, where what the government competes is they will choose maybe 2, sometimes 3 vendors to develop a prototype of what the government wants. The government will pay for the prototype, and then the government basically does a fly-off between them and chooses based on what has been submitted what the product is that works the best. Again, you're minimizing on bureaucracy, minimizing on proposals, maximizing on what can you do to do a good job.
Great. And I think if you go to our site, there is a section under best practices on that has case studies on these, many more case studies on challenges, prototypes, all of that. So we encourage everyone to really read and try to understand how they might be able to take advantage of these. So Steve, a final question. As we've talked about the process and the importance of kind of some of the missions that government take on. Now we know that also not every customer, just like not every supplier is a good supplier, not every customer is a good customer. So tell us what your perspective is on what differentiates a good government customer from not a good one.
Good question, Raj. And you're absolutely right. Some government customers are better than others. How can you tell? One early sign is, will they talk with you before the procurement rather than shutting their doors? There's been a historic tendency for the government to be very closed towards itself, to interact with industry only in very formal, not very effective venues like industry days with lots of vendors come at one time and never ask anything interesting. However, the government has the ability to meet one-on-one with vendors before they go out with a procurement team, answer their questions, hear their ideas. Many agencies don't take advantage of that, although the regulations allow it. If the agency are trying to work, one sign of, are they innovative? Are they trying to do the best job? Do they do that? If they do, that's a sign they're a good vendor. A good vendor, or not a good vendor, a good customer. A good customer also should know what their goals are from the procurement, what they want from the process, and places a lot of importance on performance and results from vendors, not just checking a box. They're not bureaucratic. It's another thing I look for in a good customer. And related to that, that they're willing and flexible to entertain new approaches towards contracting or towards what you're supplying, and not just going with the status quo. Last comment I'd make is a piece of advice to you is that to listeners are that many government people are very wary of being sold to or marketed to by contractors, by suppliers. Some of them are somewhat suspicious of for-profit companies. You have to be aware of that. If you talk with them, they will often tell you, or at least when I talk to them, they often tell me they meet too many vendors who want to spend a lot of time telling how great they are, showing them a fancy PowerPoint deck, but don't really understand their organization's work well enough. The government folks appreciate it when you show that you understand their work and appreciate their work.
No, that's sage advice, Steve, and something that I think any good company or organization, right? They should know their customers really well and what they're in business for. So totally agree, and I really love the advice on just a couple of the other things in terms of just knowing what their goals are and what I've also noticed is some good customers are also they don't presuppose they know all the answers, so they'll issue more of a problem statement and let suppliers really offer their expertise as opposed to kind of prescribing an answer that they want somebody to implement. Well, Steve, I thank you so much. I want to see if there's any questions, Frank, and that came in. No? Okay. Steve, thank you so much. This has been very interesting. Again, we know this is a topic that we could discuss for a long time. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I do encourage others to read Steve's column on Federal Computer Week. We also publish it on Public Spend Forum. He always has great stories on there and great insights, and connect with him on LinkedIn. Also, I just in closing, just briefly mention that we do have a training course coming up for suppliers that has a number of interesting lessons. It's in video form around this is focused on the federal government, so you can check it out more on our site. And come join us. So thank you, everyone, for joining.
If I could, Rod,
yes, Steve, please.
Yeah, just say to listeners as a closing from my end, for those of you who are not currently working on trying to sell to the government marketplace, I urge you to very seriously consider it, and if you do consider it and do go ahead and do it, I want to wish you good luck on behalf of all the taxpayers you'd be serving.
No, that's a very great message to close it out. So thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to engaging with you in many different ways. Thank you.